All right, thank you for the questions. We have one more speaker to go, and Robert has given me a bio about Dr. Greg Vass, and I'll quickly just read that. It says, Greg is a broken down cricket player, but does good research. That's all it says, Greg. No. Over to you, Greg, if you want to avail yourself and... Yep, he's here.
Yeah, I am here. I'm just having technology issues. Thanks, Peter. I'm having a moment. I'm having a technology moment.
We can see your screen.
No, that's not the one I want. No, I'm going to end that because that's.
Okay.
Oh, look, I'm using up my time, aren't I?
That's right. You're just building anticipation. How about that? Can you see it now? No, I can see myself. You're sharing the Teams screen. I'm glad I had a haircut though, so.
Really? It's telling me it's sharing. Is it really not sharing? Can you see
did
now?
share. You shared the Teams screen back to us.
So you can't see that.
Can't see anything at the minute.
Okay. Technology. Trust my head in. Let's just go back to this one. It's not the right one, but we'll make do. All right. So
we can see a screen that says questioning the disciplinary canon, delinking knowledge from the matrices of power.
That's not the right version. Why? It can't.
You might have to actually quit out of that PowerPoint and open it again.
I'm a bit of a techno guru. If you fax it to me, I can probably put it up.
You're very funny, Peter.
I know. There's people on this call, Natalie, who don't even know what a fax machine is.
Oh gosh, stop it. I used to be so excited when I got a fax. Remember how I rushed down to the...
Ah,
that's the same one. Yep.
Yeah, I know that was the same one. I don't understand. Am I sharing? No, I'm not sharing. Hang on.
Overhead projector. Did anyone use a Gestetner machine?
I'm getting these things in the way. Why does every other time it works and today it's not going to work?
It's all right, Greg. We're having a good time looking at your worried face and discussing technology from the 1980s.
Oh, no.
We are embracing Jenny's invitation to play a little bit while you're playing with that, so we're all good.
You're all good. You're all entertained. Otherwise entertained.
Yeah.
Oh, look, this is the only version I seem to be able to open up, so we're just going to have to roll with this. All right. Well, thank you for your patience and your indulgence there. I do also want to start by acknowledging country. I'm down on Yugambeh country, and I'd like to extend that acknowledgement and respect to all First Nations people around the place and space, and any First Nations people that might be with us today. You'll see I've got a slide up on the screen, hopefully, that offers a bit of a timeline of the Gold Coast history. I found this just a couple of weeks ago. I like to put up an image of the place that we're meeting on when acknowledging country. But in this instance, it's also in many respects germane to the sorts of things that I'm talking about in the research I'm engaged with, and that's to do with knowledge making practices and the interplay in many respects between the disciplinary canon and knowledge making practices and artifacts out and about in the world. And straight away, some of you may already be drawn to having a look at this and considering the facts, the truth, the story that is presented here. The suggestion that in 1770, you know, there was the discovery of Point Danger and Warning. Well, you know, obviously that's contested and widely understood that that's contested these days, yet we still have these sorts of timelines put up there and that sort of language used. Captain Cook discovered it in 1770. Again, another misunderstanding. He wasn't Captain Cook at the time, he was Lieutenant Cook. He got back to England and was made a captain because of the work that he'd done touring around the world. In 1842, the first accurate map of the Gold Coast was made. Well, that would be contested, of course, as well, because there's lots of people that were living here before and in various ways were producing maps that they would describe as accurate, and it doesn't require an English-born surveyor to come along in the 19th century and do that sort of work. So, you know, this notion of facts and truth and perspectives and the work that this does, and I did this sort of work myself as a history teacher. You take these sorts of things into the classroom and they produce, you know, knowledges and understandings and relationship with the place and space that we live. In this case, we can also, you know, go down to the more present 1902. And Southport had a population of 1,230. It defies really thinking about, in many respects, the idea that in a little over 120 years, that the population of the Gold Coast has swelled from, you know, what would perhaps have been only a few thousand people in total to nearly 700,000 people now. Putting that issue aside, we also need to consider it's not that long ago that First Nations people were living in and around this place and continue to do so, but it's their families. It wasn't that long ago when these first points of contact were actually taking place. And I think these sorts of timelines and facts invite us to think about just how close this notion of a historical record really is. So I'm talking about knowledge-making practices. I'm talking about questioning the disciplinary practices. I'm speaking on behalf of a team that involves Kevin Lowe, Emma Burns, and Annette Woods, and a couple of other researchers, research assistants, Catherine Thompson and David Coombs. And there's a bunch of universities involved in this ARC project. Now, I don't have time to talk about these things. These are the versions that I took out. What I wanted to do was to come to this one and just flag the idea of one of the aims in the project is understanding the specific Indigenous cultural, historic and social knowledges and disciplinary practices required of the 7 to 10 science and history curriculums specifically. And one of the things that sits at the back of our thinking for the project is this idea that Young has put up there, and what should all students know by the time they leave school? And we don't often give enough time and attention to thinking about that whole of school narrative, students coming in prep and year 1 and that sort of thing, and then exiting at the end of year 10 or 12. They don't just travel, of course, through the science or the history or the English curriculum. They travel through all of those disciplines and they piece together a narrative about themselves and their place in the world and how they understand it. And we're interested in those sorts of questions. We're also interested in that interplay between curriculum and content, and people such as Deng Zongideng make the point that in the current era of standardising assessment and curriculum and pedagogical practices and those sorts of things, that there is a problematic intertwining of curriculum and content, where in many respects the curriculum becomes the proxy for content and for pedagogy. In the context of Indigenous ed or increasing the cultural and linguistic diversity and representation within the curriculum, there's a few dominant models that have, come to bear, I guess, in many respects. We can think of it in terms of the minimum threshold content that dominated the space early on. And this sort of emerged in many respects in the 60s and 70s, where there was that recognition that there needs to be something in teaching and learning from beyond a white Eurocentric sort of a perspective. Increasingly, there's the additive sort of model. What mix are we going for? Are we looking for 20%, 30%? How fulsome is that going to be? And the debate floats in and around that. And one of the things that we increasingly encounter, particularly in the standardised environment, is the quest for unicorn content. And that's really addressing that point that teachers and school leaders are looking for that miraculous piece of content or resource that's going to do all the work for them, that's going to answer all the questions and improve learning outcomes and make sure we hit the mark in terms of the aspirations of the curriculum. Within the project, we would make the point that all of these are sort of distractions and false sort of a discussion, and deviate the conversation around from really thinking about and theorising the curriculum in different sorts of ways. For this, we would turn attention to the likes of people like Deng and Luke and others, who have made the point that our disciplinary practices go back, in that Western tradition to the time of Aristotle and the framing of disciplinary knowledge around the theoretical, the practical, and the productive domains, which have more recently become morphed into this notion of the canon, the practical, and the experiential. And this is where knowledge-making practices hone in on ideas like truths and facts. And science and math, or the so-called hard knowledge-making areas, have more of an authority than, say, the languages or history. In Bernsteinian terms, we might think of this in terms of vertical versus horizontal plane of knowledge-making practices. This sits quite in a different sort of a space to First Nations perspectives and knowledge-making practices. And I've got some comments up there from Vine Deloria, a Standing Rock Sioux from the USA, who was writing in the 1960s and 70s, in particular about the science field of science. Sorry, I'm rushing because I know how little time we have. And in particular, I guess there's that highlighted quote down the bottom there. Western knowledge-making canon and tradition makes space for being the sole source of truth for society, and the disciplinary canon then seeks to defend that status and that power. So that's the sort of thing that we're having a look at. And to go back to the theoretical, the practical, and the productive domains, what we would be wondering about is where's the place and space for something like country, which here in Australia, First Nations people would be saying we learn on from and with country, and country in and of itself is involved with knowledge-making practices. And if we think about university, high school, primary school, and the anchoring around the disciplinary canon, where does this idea of learning on from and with country really fit? To get a sense of that, I'm going to do a very quick fly through a key document for the current national curriculum. It's the shape of the Australian curriculum, and you see the foundations of this, within this location, Indigenous knowledge perspectives. So it's not recognised as knowledges. They'll be written into, the curriculum. These perspectives will be represented in learning areas. So straight away from the very first version, of the shape of the Australian curriculum, we see that positioning. And that then repeatedly plays out across the version 2 in 2010. You know, it's still a representation in learning areas. In 2012, we have this kind of slightly expanded idea as a set of organising ideas, but it's still premised on the same notions around a Western-centric curriculum. Later in 2012, the next version is basically exactly the same, and it's still emphasising this idea of, you know, how are Indigenous knowledges going to support actually the delivery of the Western knowledge-making canon and practices. And the most recent version that came out just a couple of years ago for the current iteration of the national curriculum looks a bit like this. So the cross-curriculum priorities and Indigenous knowledges are not separate from learning areas. They provide opportunities to enrich. So really we see that additive sort of a model that then leads to teachers and educators looking for the holy quest of unicorn content. How does this look in practice? Here's an example from the Year 7 science curriculum, and you can see down the bottom there in the achievement standards, it's framing identifying the potential ethical issues for intercultural considerations required for field locations and the use of secondary data. So this is a spot that the curriculum is saying explicitly you should then engage with this idea of Indigenous knowledges, perspectives and histories. And you can see that in that yellow screen there, which is linked with the actual learning outcome. And the key point being, actually, all you're doing is looking at how and why Indigenous knowledge making practices might impact on the scientific method. So the scientific method, that vertical knowledge making plane, is protected, and Indigenous knowledge making practices and ideas and perspectives are peripheral to that in many respects. That plays out then again in Year 10, where it's expanded in many respects to look at evaluative like claims and arguments and knowledge making practices. The history curriculum isn't much better. There's the preservation of the historical method, and when Indigenous knowledges, histories and perspectives come up, it's only in the context of really thinking about the evaluation of primary and secondary sources. There's no legitimacy or valuing of knowledge-making practices as something that is distinct and discrete. So again, going back to that comment from Brian Deloria earlier, it's problematic. In history, of course, nothing happened in the Middle Ages, so that's just absent altogether. And by the time you get on to Year 9 and 10, it's just looking at Indigenous knowledges and perspectives as those that have been on the receiving end of the violence of the colonial era. So the shape of the Australian curriculum maintains that additive model. Version 9 maintains that vertical approach. And there's little, if you look at that quote from Young, consideration of how the knowledge-making practices transitions from those domains like science and history into the classroom, a process that Young describes as recontextualization. Peter, your screen's on because I'm guessing you're going to want to kick me off the screen now, which is totally fine. We're at 12 o'clock. You know, there's a few other things I probably could say. I'll just really quickly just finish on this one though, with comments from Eve Tuck in particular, who draws attention to really getting serious about re-theorising curriculum and curriculum practices. And I like the idea that she lands on in terms of repatriation and rematriation, and that idea of considering curriculum in community, not on communities, and the ways that the anti-colonial and not imperialistic knowledge-making practices can be taken up. So I'm really sorry, Peter, that was a real flying whistle stop through that, not helped by me taking 5 minutes to get my slides up and running.
No, Greg, what you've done is, I think, prompted everyone to think in ways about various things, and so you've served the purpose of this. I can see there's been a few comments in the chat so there's certainly some people to follow up with there, and some ideas about other work. Everyone, it is 12 o'clock, and we're keen that we stick to time. I know some of you might be able to hang around, but for those of you who have other things that are important and need to do, I want to say thank you. Thank you so much to our 4 speakers for presenting us with some really meaty things to have a chew over as we think about these ideas. And yeah, isn't it fun to talk about ideas again? Remember when this was part of our work?
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you for the opportunity to chat. Really appreciate it. Thanks for encouraging it, Leonie, and facilitating today, Peter. And thanks for all the positive comments, everybody. That's really lovely of you.
Okay, well.